I want to thank you for inviting me to try to predict the future just before a global pandemic and another attempted reckoning with centuries of racial violence and genocide, which continues to transform lives around the world at speeds no one can possibly keep up with. If you are feeling just soaringly confident in your ability to predict the future, then I want some of what you had to drink this morning. Me being me, I obviously can't deliver the talk I've prepared without this disclaimer. I have no earthly clue what the future of anything, let alone food, is going to look like. Instead, what I have prepared is a kind of future-looking etiquette guide that takes into account some of the early lessons of the immediate crises and doesn't, at least totally, lose sight of the many other ongoing entangled crises of climate change, poverty, addiction, violent struggles over drugs and fossil fuels, and a global refugee crisis. But I'll stop before this becomes any more of a dirge, because against just about everything in my nature, I also believe this to be a moment of great hope and potential. I offer these suggestions on manners in the spirit of, as Donna Haraway puts it, shaping conditions for multi-species flourishing in the face of terrible histories, and sometimes joyful histories too. The manners lesson comes at the end of this meal, and apologies, you may ignore my epigraphs or read them for yourself, but because I accidentally wrote a 90-minute talk that I'm trying to deliver in 45 minutes, I've cut almost all direct references to them. So here's what's on the menu. And if 7 short lectures is easier to watch than 1 long one, then I invite you to hit pause whenever you see this screen. First, we must make a reservation. I'll ask you to help me figure out when this Anthropocene, whose food futures we are convening to discuss, began. As we approach this meal, what I'm asking us to think about is how the ways we tell stories, including about time and eras, determine the kinds of futures, food futures or otherwise, that we can imagine. Rather than waiting for a reservation that will never arrive, I've arranged for us to start with an aperitif, something bitter and I hope stimulating. I will argue that whatever scene we're in, we are more importantly in a time of apocalypse. The first more substantial course will argue that our apocalyptic moment is making it possible for us to think in ways that were not previously possible, that look beyond the individual as the center of everything. For the soup course, we will dive into the Atlantic Ocean and emerge on the shores of the New World, as did the many Black writers and theorists who have been arguing against the liberal individual human subject and atomized notion of the self for centuries. The pandemic and the movement for Black lives have made this work make sense in new ways, and like soup, this course could have been endless and still left most people, including me, dissatisfied. But we must leave room for the main course, the heart of my argument, which is that eating and food are good for thinking about our relationality and multitudinousness, because eating is the paradigmatic relationship, or as Lisa Helke puts it with a viscerality I love, it's chomping all the way down. If we can make it through the heart, a kind of awful, though I hope it won't be, the treat, the dessert that awaits is a pair of stories for thinking through what it might look like in practice to consent not to be a single being. The first story, my story of lamentable symbiosis, is Shel Silverstein's picture book, The Giving Tree. The second, my story of wise symbiosis, is an episode of the first season of the Australian-American sci-fi television show Farscape called Exodus from Genesis, in which the living ship Moya and her stowaway passengers are threatened by parasites who can produce replicants of them. These stories and others point to a shared cultural wisdom about how to be multiple that I'm seeking to mine for etiquette advice for multi-species flourishing. How should we behave knowing that we are always eating and being eaten? Returning to the fiction that we are ever not eating, let us make our reservations. As modern diners, our first step is to take out our phones. I mean this, really do it, please. Grab any browser-enabled device and point it to https://317kxih. That's https://bit.ly/317kxih, and enter into the single text field the year you think the Anthropocene began. Round or be precise as is your preference. Pluralize if it makes you happier. 1700s? Not a hint. The form will not collect any information that could identify you, and I will show you the preliminary results when we meet in a few weeks' time. Keen students may be waiting to see if I'm going to offer any clues, like perhaps a definition of the Anthropocene. Here's one I like from Andrew Baldwin and Bruce Erickson. Quote, "The Anthropocene is a term used in both popular and scientific discourse to designate a unit of geological time in which humanity, anthropos, is said to be leaving its own stratigraphic signature on Earth's geology. Throughout the 2000s, the term entered popular discourse as a signifier of environmental crisis, and until recently, the main scientific question surrounding the Anthropocene was not whether it was occurring, but which stratigraphic signature should be used to distinguish it from the Holocene, the age of the glaciers. The term itself dates to a 2000 article in a Geology Association's newsletter, whose authors followed it up with the 2000 piece in Nature, and by 2011, the cover of The Economist was welcoming non-scientists to the Anthropocene heralded as geology's new age. That issue's cover suggests that the Anthropocene is just beginning, or at the very least that it is a modern industrial project, the globe being constructed over scaffolding, the world a skyscraper. But geologists themselves have never suggested that they, by some remarkable coincidence, discovered the Anthropocene just as it was beginning. Instead, according to Professor of Inhuman Geology, Catherine Yusof, from whose book A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, I've borrowed the theoretical hydraulics of this argument, her work is doing all the heavy lifting. The scientific community offer us three possible material beginnings for the Anthropocene subject: the Columbian Exchange or Orbis hypothesis event, 1610, the Industrial Revolution and James Watt's steam engine, 1800, and the great acceleration marked by nuclear isotopes from missile testing, the 1950s. Yusof argues that the problem with declaring any of these moments the beginning of humanity's stratigraphic signature in the Earth's geology is that they attribute to all of humanity, anthropos, a geological signature actually caused by the actions of a small number of white Euro-American colonists who already get to stand in for the universal we far too often. Donna Haraway calls the story of the Anthropocene a prick tale, a, quote, tragic story with only one real actor, one real world maker, the hero. All others in the prick tale are props, ground, plot space, or prey. End quote. Yusof argues that each of the possible Anthropocene stories given to us by scientists are essentially prick stories. The 1610 prick story features the explorer as hero, like the one atop Smithsonian Magazine's 2013 inquiry into the question, or more quintessentially Christopher Columbus, this guy's clothes are a little too modern. Its stratigraphic signature is known as the Orbis spike, a sharp dip in atmospheric carbon around 1610 that followed the genocide of indigenous populations in the Americas. The 1810 story, favored by the term Anthropocene's originators, centers an inventor or entrepreneur hero, quintessentially James Watt and his steam engine not pictured. This story has sometimes been dubbed the Capitalocene for the way it focuses on the revolutionary character of the industrialization and fossil fuel use and thus climate change. Like most accounts of European industrial revolution, it ignores the prehistory of capital and the wealth generated by indigenous dispossession and the transatlantic kidnapping and enslavement of humans to produce sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coal. The 1950s story seems to be moving towards canonicity. Last year, the Anthropocene Working Group convened by the International Union of Geological Sciences voted to recommend dating the Anthropocene the mid-20th century. Geologic signature of radioactive fallout from nuclear testing and America's bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is a clearer marker than changes in carbon or nitrogen cycles. The Anthropocene man on the cover of Nature is neither explorer colonist nor inventor factory owner. He is posed as a cover model, a GQ fantasy of the consumer as masculine hero instead of its feminine patsy. Yusof points out that the middle passage here is rendered as a sort of hipster tattoo, and the industry in his arm turns him into a cyborg. He wears acknowledgement of brutal history as a kind of rebellious style, and although his body is interpenetrated by industrial disaster on one side and delicately intertwined to nature on the other, his head remains above it all. Here is the prick story of the Anthropocene that starts with the nuclear age, the head that seems unaware of how its body is flayed open by history and interwoven with other kinds of life. What the focus on this particular prick story obscures, Yusof argues, is nuclear colonialism, the strategic use of indigenous bodies and lands to absorb nuclear test radiation, dispose of nuclear waste, and both provide uranium and absorb the pollution created by its mining. If it begins in the 1950s, the Anthropocene tells only the story of the we who became consumers in this atomic age, erasing from all agency and geological significance the humans who mine the minerals, assemble the circuitry, suffer from the toxic byproducts, and yet remain in many ways excluded from the digital culture conjured on our millions of tiny screens. And so, despite suggesting mere moments ago that it would be a remarkable coincidence for geologists to have discovered the age of human interference in geology just as it were beginning, I find that if I must talk about the Anthropocene, it does begin for me with 2000, when people began to talk about the Anthropocene, which coincided not with the beginning of humans leaving a stratigraphic trace in Earth's geology, but with the spread of precarity into the lives of the kinds of white liberal subjects who expect to have agency, who expect to be able to inhabit the heroic role and fashion themselves as masters of the universe. Yusof again. If the imagination of planetary peril coerces an ideal of we, it only does so when the trappings of late liberalism become threatened. The imaginary of planetary peril that made the Anthropocene culturally and conceptually essential, if not chronologically clear, began around 2000, the time of the second President Bush and 9/11, terror and turmoil over the control of fossil fuels, and Al Gore earnestly trying to get people to grapple with inconvenient truths. So that's my answer. I'll enter it as soon as I'm done here. Like a magic spell, the Anthropocene was conjured into being by its naming. But it is not the name that feels most appropriate to me for the times we are enduring or entering. Whether or not we want to call what we're living in now the Anthropocene, the more important aspect of our moment for thinking about what kinds of food futures we might be cultivating is that it is apocalyptic. According to Lutheran minister Nadia Bolz-Weber, in Greek, the word apocalypse means to uncover, to peel away, to show what's underneath. That's what this country has been experiencing. And what has it uncovered? Bolz-Weber. That, quote, the venom of domination runs deeply in us as a country and a people, end quote. Bolz-Weber was writing in 2018 in the early days of the Me Too movement, but her words feel even more true in the wake of the vastly disproportionate deaths of Black and Brown Americans in the epidemics of COVID-19 and violent policing. The brutal reality testified to by the 8 minutes and 46 seconds Officer Chauvin kneeled on George Floyd's neck, and the reason the duration itself became a rallying cry of the movement for Black lives are all part of an ongoing apocalypse in the United States. A country that makes it possible for police to kill Black people with the total impunity flaunted by those endless seconds seems to have given at least some of us no choice but to face the venom of domination that runs deeply in us. A country where over 210,000 have died of COVID-19 and there is still no plan in place to protect the rest of us from taking our turn on the COVID roulette, has impressed upon some of us how much less free we are than people who seem to have learned to cooperate better. My hope that something might be different this time about the uncovering of racism, our ongoing interrogation of sexism, poverty, climate change, and addiction, despair, is my suspicion that the pandemic has caused another apocalypse in our notion of the individual. The experience of quarantine, as absolutely different as everyone's has been, has made it clear just how hard it is for most of us to be apart from each other, and how meaningless any notions of freedom or independence are if they don't also foster communities where we can be safe and connected. Alone in our separate households, or heading out to do essential work within 6 feet bubbles with our faces shielded, desperately trying to communicate friendliness with our eyes, and wondering if we're going to be able to keep the Postal Service solvent through the election, those of us who imagined ourselves free have never felt ourselves less so. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has created the conditions for some of us to have an apocalyptic revelation about our interdependence, about the beauty and necessity of being part of a multitude. Ready for something more substantial? Thinking of my gut as a tube, which of course it is, has enabled me to see how that which feels most internal to me, the place I even claim rhetorically that my moral instincts come from, my gut, is simultaneously a kind of exterior. My gut is a surface through which I not only encounter the world in the form of food, water, and air, but also selectively bring parts of that outside inside, and only with its assistance from microbial communities I barely understand, turn it into more of what seems unquestionably me. But even if I can pinpoint when what was donut becomes Margot, what of those microbial helpers? Are the sprinkles on this donut part of the donut? Or are they on the donut, but themselves ontologically separate? Does it matter if there's a layer of frosting hidden underneath or if they're baked directly into the cake part? We're just beginning to understand the interrelated bacterial, fungal, and virus-speckled worlds permeating, surrounding, constituting us. Microbiolomics is already making inroads into personal hygiene and nutrition. There are soaps designed not to kill the good bacteria on your skin or spray better colonies on. Companies that provide individualized dietary advice based in part on an analysis of your particular gut bugs. How will increasing knowledge about our constitutive communities affect our notions of self, what is me, and other, what is not me? In Donna Haraway's 2016 Staying with the Trouble I've already been quoting from, she claims, bounded individualism in its many flavors in science, politics, and philosophy has finally become unavailable to think with, truly no longer thinkable, technically or any other way, end quote. And later, quote, neither biology nor philosophy any longer supports the notion of independent organisms and environments, that is, interacting units plus context/rules, end quote. But however beyond the self biology and philosophy might be, for average humans like me, bounded individualism has been not just available to think with, but the basic architecture of my thinking. Haldke captures the disquieting distance between our everyday thinking and the multitudinous notion of self. Quote, recent biology and philosophy notwithstanding, atomistic individualism still operates at a not quite conscious, not quite articulable level for many of us whose common sense experience in the world is shaped by modern Western thought. Try to reconcile the microbiome in a donut model with the go-to model for those of us who imbibed Descartes before we knew we were doing it. The human individual as billiard ball, a self-contained creature for whom relationships with other creatures are accidental to us, not part of our essence. I heard Lisa give a version of this paper at the annual meeting of the Association for the Study of Food and Society in 2017 and found it entirely convincing and completely baffling. What are we to do with the knowledge that we are teeming with life in and on every surface? That the number of cells not belonging to us, a pronoun that turns out to be much more slippery than I'm comfortable with, might outnumber the cells that do. It's one thing to have a formal knowledge that everything from soil fertility to obesity to acne to moods depends on these microbial communities, some beneficial, some parasitic, some pathogenic. But a whole nother thing entirely to somehow try to understand myself as being constituted by that riot of life. Not colonized by it, not a container for it, but the whole mad riot itself. I feel that I am a me. Does a riot have a me? Heldke's donut is a sort of metaphor designed to help us think multitudinously, and I don't think it's incidental that many of the writers recently preoccupied with thinking beyond individualism have their own favorite metaphor. They're trying to give the descendants of Descartes new tools for thinking. 3 I have recently added to my toolkit and will offer to you now are a glowing squid, lichen, and Matsutake mushroom. This extremely photogenic squid is about the size of your palm, and it glows because of luminescing vibrio bacteria that live in its ventral pouches. It's a kind of camouflage, as Haraway describes, quote, so that the hunting squid can look like a starry night sky to its prey below on dark nights, end quote. She goes on, explaining why this sort of glowing visual poem to symbiosis is her favorite, mine too, that's the title of the talk. Quote, unless the juvenile squid are infected in the right spot at the right time by the right bacteria, they do not develop their own structures for housing bacteria when they are hunting adults. The bacteria are fully part of the squid's developmental biology. In addition, the bacteria produce signals that regulate the adult squid's circadian rhythms. The squid regulate bacterial numbers, exclude unwanted associates, and provide inviting services for setting up vibrio homes. The squid and bacteria aren't separate entities that come together to cooperate. To become an adult squid requires careful attention to being a good home for vibrio, allowing the vibrio to reshape its body and tell it when to wake and sleep. Remember these demands when we come to the giving tree. These are extreme adaptations, and without them, the squid does not survive. And yet, there are cells that are squid and cells that are vibrio. Distinctions can be made. The greater difficulty of making those kinds of distinctions in lichen has had biologists Scott Gilbert and Jan Sapp, along with philosopher Alfred Tauber, declaring, we're all lichens now, since around 2012. Exactly what lichen are must be too obvious to biologists to bear explaining. There's no definition in their landmark paper, but for the rest of us, there's Wikipedia. A lichen is a composite organism that arises from algae or cyanobacteria living among filaments of multiple fungi species in a mutualistic relationship. This is why lichen do not have roots or absorb water and nutrients like plants do. So they can grow on rock faces with no need for soil. The difficulty of thinking symbiotically, however, marks the final sentence of the Wikipedia entry's subsection on symbiotic relation, which reads, the algae may lose up to 80% of their sugar production to the fungus, end quote. As if algal sugar production, by virtue of taking place in the algae, ought to be expected to stay there, and any sugar consumed by the fungal cells of the lichen is somehow lost to the algae, living as it does in partnership. It's as if I were to say, I lose 80% of the bread I make to my spouse and kids. I made it for all of us. If they don't eat it, it goes to waste. Furthermore, just a few sentences earlier, the entry notes that 2 species of algae are found in over 35% of all lichen, and they are rarely found living on their own. The algae aren't some kind of biological suckers doing all the work while the fungus freeloads. This algae prefers to live with fungus that cannot photosynthesize on its own. Together, they inhabit spaces neither could venture alone. What if, instead of seeing that as a relationship in which anyone wins or loses anything, we tried saying the algae may devote as much as 80% of their sugar production to the fungus? You could, I suppose, think of the algae as paying rent to the fungus, but I prefer to see them as enmeshed in a relationship of caring for each other, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. And yet I appreciate how that claim about what the algae loses makes it clear that even in a totally symbiotic being, which is not algae or fungus, but both, it's still possible to make the kinds of distinctions and tell the kinds of stories that involve competing species, competing selves. This, I suspect, is one of the reasons anthropologist Anna Lowenhaupt-Singh finds the Matsutake mushroom so compelling. Matsutake has been long prized in Japan and Korea as a marker of autumn. It grows rarely in Japan now, but has been discovered all over the world. Some Japanese people make distinctions between Matsutake from different parts of the world reflected in what they're willing to pay and how they describe them. As one importer told Singh, quote, "Matsutake are like people. American mushrooms are white because the people are white. Chinese mushrooms are black because the people are black. Japanese people and mushrooms are nicely in between." End quote. Many of us balk at categorizing nations of people this way, but scientists' categorizations of mushrooms from different countries just a few decades ago turned out to be just as inaccurate. The even more metaphorically exciting thing about Matsutake is how they reproduce. Here's Singh. Matsutake spores are haploid, that is, bearing only one series of chromosomes rather than paired sets. We might expect them to mate with other haploid spores, thus making full pairs. They do. Human eggs and sperm join that way. But Matsutake spores are capable of something else. They can join with body cells that already have chromosomal pairs. It's as if I decided to mate with, not clone, my own arm. How queer. End quote. I admit to a fascination with obvious mosaics, like calico cats or the rare chimera butterfly, but I've always thought of them as categorically exceptional. I suspect this reflects my own buy-in to what Scott Gilbert et al. Call the fallacy of DNA as soul, the belief that our very individuality is ratified by the unique, personal, immutable, singular, and replicable genetic code running through every one of our cells and implicitly nothing and no one else's. In other words, one of the ways I know I'm me and the bacteria in me are not me is because I have my DNA and they have theirs. Epigenetics, or the growing field devoted to understanding what influences whether and how genes are expressed, is destabilizing that kind of genetic essentialism. But it turns out even the idea that all the cells I think of as mine have the same DNA isn't likely true. People with cancer and people who become pregnant all experience a more obvious version of having multiple different DNAs. As a short editorial on cancer as mosaicism in current oncology noted, it may be that all humans are mosaics, but that some of us are more mosaic than others. And fetal cells migrate all over a mother's body, some taking up permanent residence in her heart, lungs, and blood. A 2014 study of 242 elderly Danish women found that 70% had Y-sex chromosomes in their blood, evidence they'd at some point gestated a Y-sex chromosome having human. And there were some intriguing differences in rates of cardiovascular disease and cancer rates of women who had these cells compared to those who didn't. We are not billiard balls with a unitary self here and the world and other beings out there. We're donuts made of symbiotic communities and beings and species that aren't even genetically identical within themselves, all constantly feeding and eating each other. And since we haven't managed to recruit anything photosynthetic to join this particular donut party, which is one important way we are not lichens, we have to eat something else to survive. This recent burst of Western intellectual interest in symbiosis and chimerism and how it challenges individual personhood is still scrambling to find the right foundational metaphors. Meanwhile, writers and thinkers on the margins of subjectivity have been grappling with the dominant culture's refusal to allow them access to the prevailing sense of human selfhood for as long as they've been putting the experience of marginality into words. And so the soup is built on a broth that's been simmering on some back burner since before living memory. In 2009, Manthia Diawara filmed himself in conversation with Edouard Glissant on a cross-Atlantic journey from the United Kingdom to Brooklyn. In the resulting film, One World in Relation, Glissant explains what it is about the African diaspora that forced stolen people into the experience of multiplicity by describing 3 moments in the transatlantic journey: departure, the midpoint, and arrival. On departure, Glissant says, it's the moment when one consents not to be a single being and attempts to be many beings at the same time. In other words, for me, every diaspora is the passage from unity to multiplicity. On the midpoint, Glissant expands on the idea of the abyss, saying the middle passage was truly the unknown. No shore to their right, no shore to their left, and nothing in front of them. What characterizes the African situation in this adventure is the abyss. And I think the abyss's dimension is not, contrary to one what might believe, the dimension of unity, but rather the dimension of multiplicity. And lastly, when Diawara asks about arrival, Glissant says, for me, the arrival is the moment where all the components of humanity, not just the African ones, consent to the idea that it is possible to be one and multiple at the same time, that you can be yourself and the other, that you can be the same and the different, end quote. Glissant shows how multiplicity is inherent in the experience of being yanked from the place where your lichen mushroom donut formed. After leaving, you become different, and yet you are forever marked by the place of origin you can never return to. Diaspora, departure without return, makes you multiple. The apocalyptic revelation about our multiplicity is inseparable from the apocalyptic revelation about the venom of domination that runs deeply in us. As Dion Brand argues, quote, the monetizing of every square meter of air, water, and land, the triumph of capitalism has given rise to what is now called populism, but is actually fascism. The inability to conceive of the sharing of the world and the demonizing and casting out of people who are blamed for being in the world. To me, Black people in the West have always lived under conditions of fascism. It is that in this particular moment, there is an acute peak in the instantiation of fascism. We are experiencing a kind of eruption from the magma chamber of right-wing white supremacy, and we're experiencing at the same time a kind of capitulation of liberal democracy and its tolerance logics that underwrite a kind of benign racism, as those with a kind of brutal sense of entitlement and a righteous sense of their own violent colonial histories plot more drastically how to keep the world for themselves. Trump may be personally responsible for much of the deadly disinformation about the real risks of COVID-19 and our national failure to keep doctors and nurses safe. But it's not really his fault, at least directly, that our health systems couldn't figure out how to make enough money, even while they were working full tilt to keep from laying people off in the midst of a pandemic. Hospitals began categorizing social workers that help coordinate people's care or transition back home as non-essential, at the same time as many white liberals began to seriously debate whether social workers might be better at responding to public safety needs than the police, who are still killing people in the US at the rate of 3 per day in 2020. Although not a recent development, this summer revealed that we live in a state that has infinite resources for tear gas and bullets to disperse peaceful protesters, but no capacity to provide for our collective health or safety or flourishing. The apocalyptic revelation about the venom of domination that runs deeply in us as a nation and a people is not about a newly emergent fascism, but the one we've been living under our entire lives. 2 texts I encountered for the first time this summer have made it clear that this revelation was always available to me. I simply had not made it. The first is Richard Pryor live in concert, a stand-up set recorded in Long Beach in December 1979, 2 years before my birth. And the second is Sylvia Wynter's open letter, No Humans Involved, written in the aftermath of the Rodney King verdict in 1992. Pryor's set comes back to police brutality again and again. As the audience is still finding their seats, he mentions seeing a Black man getting patted down outside the theater on his way in, and jokes about how hard it is getting someone to pick you up from jail in Long Beach, because of course the jails are for people who live elsewhere, not white people. An extended riff on his unsuccessful attempts at dog training is set up by asking if the Long Beach audience knows about how nasty police dogs are. The one thing that struck me as dated in a set whose jokes mostly still land with sickening currency were the follow-ups that played on the possibility that the white Long Beach audience might not get the jokes, might truly have no idea how the co-residents of their city were routinely treated by officers of the law. But they did get the jokes. They shrieked with laughter, both shocked and knowing. There it was, available for me to know my whole life, the starkness of racial segregation in American cities and the way police harassment, abuse, and killing of Black and poor people reinforced those divides. After the videotaped footage of police officers beating Rodney King made no difference at all in the outcome of the trial and all were acquitted, Pryor's jokes about white people's ignorance could no longer be told in the same way. It became clear to any still harboring doubts that the reason no one had done anything to stop the police and other vigilantes from killing Black and poor people was not that white people did not know about the racist violence Black people had been subject to forever, but that they did not care. The title of Wynter's letter, No Humans Involved, as she explains in the first paragraph, refers to the fact reported on public radio in their coverage of the Rodney King assault trial that, quote, public officials of the judicial system of Los Angeles routinely used the acronym NHI to refer to any case involving the breach of the rights of young Black males who belong to the jobless category of inner city ghettos. NHI means No Humans Involved. Her reason for addressing her colleagues in academia is that this system of classification, quote, was held by both the officers involved in this specific case, as well as by the mainly white middle-class suburban Simi Valley jurors and the judicial officers of Los Angeles, and therefore by the brightest and best graduates of both the professional and non-professional schools of the university system of the United States. How did they come to conceive of what it means to be both human and North American in the kinds of terms within whose logic the jobless and usually school dropout push-out category of young Black males can be perceived and therefore behaved toward only as the lack of the human, the conceptual other to being North American? The answer, she says, is the same process that was used to dehumanize Jewish and Armenian people before their genocides. Quoting Helen Fine's Accounting for Genocide, over the millennium which preceded their group annihilation, both Jews and Armenians had been decreed by the dominant group that was to perpetrate in the crime, to be outside the sanctified universe of obligation, that circle of people with reciprocal obligations to protect each other. End quote. And it's their education in part that prepares them to do that by telling virtually nothing but prick stories. Winter cites Black educator Carter Woodson, whose analysis of the curricula in 1933 concluded that its systematic racist distortions, quote, served an extra cognitive function, that of inducing white students to believe that their ancestors had done everything worth doing in both the past, and at the same time to induce the Black students to believe that their ancestors had done nothing worth doing, whether in the human or the American past. Why not, Woodson asked, exploit, enslave, or exterminate a class that everybody is taught to regard as inferior? What is required, Winter argues, is not the smattering of electives on race and ethnicity now required of most graduates with four-year degrees, but a rethinking of the, quote, mode of truth or epistemological order based on the representation of the human as if it were a natural organism, end quote. We have been called for decades by Winter and her colleagues in Black studies and critical ethnic studies to learn to think and see how enmeshed we are, and to develop and pursue ways of knowing adequate to our entanglement. The myth of the singular billiard ball self competing with other billiard ball selves for scarce resources none of us would want to lose, even to a symbiont, is the kind of pervasive storytelling that causes us to see people as others instead of partners. The overinvestment in the unitary self is what enables us to exclude whole swaths of people from our sanctified universe of obligation. The endless repetition of prick stories is what enables people and systems we build to render most of humanity worthless. As part of the great majority of humanity denied full subjectivity, marginalized writers have always struggled against their exclusion from the representation of the human as if it were a natural organism. Those who experienced the abyss of African diaspora, consented to multiplicity, and refused to cling fiercely to their singularity have been calling for and modeling new ways of thinking for decades. I hope the apocalypse and individualism can help us finally respond to that call and fulfill the mandates of what we are uncovering. Now, I'm going to turn off the camera for a moment while I quickly relocate for the next section. Hello again, and welcome to my bathroom. I've decided to record this part of the talk here because this is where dinner always leads us eventually, and it is the room in the house where I am most reminded that we are also dinner. In the early weeks of our pandemic isolation, I was standing right here when I had a sudden intestinal spasm, got myself to the toilet, and then after stumbling into the shower to turn on cold water because I was feeling faint, did faint, mildly concussing my head on the other side of this shower wall. And that's how I learned that I was, either once again or still, colonized by Helicobacter pylori, or H. pylori bacteria, now best known as the actual cause of most stomach ulcers that were blamed for years on poor eating and stress management habits of the afflicted. Obesity blame mongers? Take notice, microbiology is coming for your personal responsibility stories too. Trying to eliminate, but also understand the co-residence of my belly has given me a new appreciation of another thing Lisa Heldke says in It's Chomping All the Way Down, which is that symbiotic relationships are not, as we like to use the word metaphorically, always or even typically mutually beneficial. Sometimes they might be, but more often than not, one benefits more than the other, or the relationship is hostile or hazardous to one or more participants. We live with pathogens and predators and parasites too, even if we think we prefer to live with friends. Just to state the obvious here, no one wants to be a parasite. To call someone a parasite is usually a crushing insult. But as Heldke and others like Michael Serres argue, parasitic relationships are not bad or sick or wrong. They simply are. If you need to suck something's blood to survive, then you do. There's no point in judging it. Heldke says, quote, living things eat each other, persistently, regularly, of necessity. Our conceptions of the individual cannot avoid coming to terms with this, end quote. We may not want to be parasites, but we are, or at least we start out that way. We loathe the idea of parasitism with the intensity we fear being as dependent and vulnerable as we are. What and who does the mad collection of stuff that I am need to eat? And what do we feed? My quest to figure out whether I can eliminate or coexist with the H. pylori in my gut briefly involved the possibility that I might be affected by an autoimmune condition called Behçet's that's rare in the United States, but somewhat more common in Turkey and Japan, where some of my genetic ancestors lived. It turns out that the salted pickled ume plum called umeboshi appears to moderate the symptoms of H. pylori, which may be the reason it's associated with health in Japan. There's a saying of rough equivalent to the American apple a day that claims that eating umeboshi is a kind of prophylactic for medical care. This health halo may also be why my mom has retained occasional umeboshi eating among her few ethnically marked habits. I must have tried it at least once because I remember thinking about it. Who would eat something that tasted like that twice? Somehow, without my having had it at any intervening time that I can remember, I began to crave umeboshi in adulthood and started buying them and eating them with rice the way I had seen my mother do. Could H. pylori have given me a taste for this medicinal food developed by genetic ancestors I live in uncertain relationship with? If I eliminate the H. pylori from my body, will the taste for umeboshi remain? What about the meditation practices I began due to my intestinal distress? What if what distinguishes beings of individual ontological concern is their need to consume other living things? My cells may not be mostly mine, and even those that are may not be genetically identical, but whatever this collection of consumed critters I call my body consists of, I also need to eat via the orifices and surfaces I call mine. What if I am because I eat? If needs produce powers, as Sylvia Wynter says, perhaps one of the powers my need to eat produces is the I who needs to do it. Maybe a riot does have a me, as long as it also needs to be fed. Camera off again. See you again in a moment. Although people like me may be new to thinking multitudinously, we are none of us new to being multitudinous. The apocalypse of individuality uncovers a truth we have already been living. I'm starting to look for cultural narratives about multiplicity and symbiosis and how audiences understand those narratives, seeking lessons from the great repository of wisdom represented by the stories we tell each other about what works and what doesn't in the great and ongoing attempt to coexist. What can the stories we tell about symbiosis teach us about what it means to be with? The first story is a kind of cautionary tale about symbiosis gone wrong, Shel Silverstein's 1964 picture book, The Giving Tree. It tells the story of a relationship between a tree who apparently uses she, her pronouns, and a boy who loves to spend time with her as a child, but who grows up and gets busy and starts coming around only to ask for things: money, a house, a boat. She gives him everything she has, letting him literally cut down first her branches, then her trunk, at which point a sweet refrain about the tree being happy every time she sees that the boy is happy takes a turn. She was happy, but not really. In 2019, playwright Topher Payne published a revised version as part of a series of children's book rewrites called Topher Fixed It. In The Tree Who Set Healthy Boundaries, the tree still gives the boy apples to sell when he asks for money, but when he comes back asking for a house, she says no. She tells him how it feels when he only comes around when he needs something, referring to the relationship as a friendship, which may be permitted to change as they age, but not by her stunting herself to serve him. In Payne's version, the boy becomes a chef and the tree gets a distance learning degree in business administration, and together they open an apple pie bakery that turns a profit in its first 18 months. Payne isn't the first to revise the story. In 1979, Jacqueline Jackson and Carol Dell wrote a version called The Other Giving Tree, designed to counter the dangers they perceived in a story largely read not as about the relationship between two friends, but as between a mother and son, and one that struck so many people as noxious that a library in Colorado banned it for sexism in 1988. A dinosaur expert named Bob Strauss consulted about yet another interpretation, the tree as nature and boy as God, without prompting declared his disgust for the book. I refuse to read it to my kids or my friends' kids. I think that book has done more damage to fragile young psyches than any other book in the last 50 years, end quote. But the virality of Payne's version, and especially the way I saw people reacting to it on social media and describing their memories of reading the original story as children, does not convince me that even young children, everywhere assumed to be highly impressionable and uncritical readers, understand the relationship in this book to be a paradigm to aspire to. It doesn't end with the not really happy stump. The boy returns one final time a hunched old man. And here's the page that has been chilling to me since I was a child. The stump apologizes for the way she has crippled herself to serve him, apologizes for no longer having apples to eat or branches to swing from. But since he no longer wants anything from her but a place to rest, she can still provide the only thing he needs. She gives, he takes. She is once again declared happy. Children may make mistakes when they read, but they do not typically make mistakes like seeing the churlish boy who comes demanding everything the tree has without so much as using his manners words as some kind of role model. As many people responding to Payne's version reported, this book strikes even many children as troublesome and depressing, while others grew up in homes where it was banned, usually by mom, for offering a self-destructive view of generosity, or followed up with a stern instruction to never be like either that boy or that tree. The reason the rewrite went viral is not because generations of current internet-using adults had their fragile psyches damaged by this book, but because even children recognize that the original ending is not happy, not really. Children like me saw this story as a terrifying parable of how parasites that kill their hosts come to regret it, or more simply, just that relationships where one gives and one takes look sad and lonely in the end for both of them. Payne's rewrite does not have the ring of truth to me, and not just because the fledgling bakery turns a profit. The last page lectures the reader. Setting healthy boundaries is a very important part of giving. It assures you'll always have something left to give. And so the tree was happy. Everyone was. End quote. The 1988 feminist rewrite draws the line at apples too. In their version, the second tree, the other giving tree, says, sure, you can have the resources I can replace, but no more than that. And in many relationships, that might be a fine place to draw the line, but I don't think the cause of the tragedy is that the tree let him cut her down. It's that she did so even though we are given to understand she did not really want to. And we see that she has no reason to. He is demanding and unkind. He does not treat her with care and respect. She longs for his company. He has no interest in giving it to her. But I don't think the measure of whether you should give something away is whether you can replace it or reserve some for the red squirrels. Not everything we have to give can be reproduced or parceled out as neatly as apples. What if the boy's need for shelter or transportation had been more desperate or urgent? What if the tree knew she were dying and had the opportunity to choose to accelerate that, to give her child, a friend, or even a stranger, something that might be valuable, something that might preserve their own life? Would we expect the tree to feel the same about letting Noah cut her down to build his ark? Who can say what your boundaries must or may not preserve? Who else should dictate what aims you ought to contribute to, or at what cost to you? Another thing that feels unrealistic and strained about Payne's rewrite is the scrupulous attention to these friends' equal standing. It's not enough for the tree to keep growing the apples for the pies. She has to get a credential and become a managing partner in the bakery. No wonder Payne can't allow the relationship to remain indeterminate enough to still say something true about both friendships and parent-child relationships. We may deserve equal consideration, but we are not always or usually equal. We need to be able to imagine healthy and harmonious relationships between people who do not have equal powers or needs, especially if we're going to imagine them between different communities and nations and species. If you're satisfied or just stuffed, please consider yourself released. But if you have another 10 minutes, 5 of which are for video clips, stay with me. The television show Farscape, the whole series, is one of my favorite attempts to imagine multi-species flourishing. And my story of wise symbiosis comes from the second episode of the show, which conveniently begins with a 30-second recap of all the information a brand new viewer might need to understand what happens next. So here that is.
An astronaut. Radiation wave hit and I got shot through a wormhole. I'm lost in some distant part of the universe on a ship. A living ship full of strange alien life forms. Help me. Listen, please. Is there anybody out there who can hear me? I'm being hunted by an insane military commander and everything I can. I'm just looking for a way home.
At the start of this episode, the spaceship Moya, which as John just described is a living ship, a sentient being who will in subsequent episodes of the show get pregnant and deliver an infant spaceship, for that is how the species reproduces, is infected by a cloud of insects, each about the size of a chihuahua. The trouble begins when John Crichton, by facial structure and origin on Earth, obviously our protagonist, squishes one of these bugs. And not long after that, encounters a replica of himself who cannot speak but is filled with the same blue goo as the bugs. Soon, replicas of the entire crew are popping up, seemingly conspiring to make the ship hotter and hotter, which makes all of them uncomfortable but poses a particular threat to Aaron, a defector from the Orwellianly named Peacekeepers, a black-clad military force that terrorizes this entire distant part of space. As Aaron explains, high heat can cause what peacekeepers call living death, a kind of incurable madness that's the only thing that causes her kind to kill their own. While the tentacle-headed, tribally tattooed character called Dargo establishes his species' warrior tendencies akin to the Klingon in Star Trek by advocating attacking the parasites, Zahn, the bald, blue, anarchist priest of a religion called the Delvian Sikh, and John strive instead to understand what these bugs are up to. Here's the critical scene, about 3 minutes long, and Zahn's body and voice have been commandeered by creatures she's about to introduce as the Drac.
I am monarch of the Drac.
Drac.
These are my aggregate. You attack me during my genesis, and you must die.
What the hell is Genesis?
You asked the wrong warrior.
Wait!
This is one of them.
No, it's the real Zan. She's talking. The Xeroxes can't do that. What have you done to our friend?
I use her for my voice. She will die when you die to save Genesis.
Genesis. The nest. The nest. This is some sort of spawning. And you're the queen?
Life must continue.
You live in space. Freezing space. But you need warmth to lay your eggs, or to give birth. Only to give birth. So when you're finished, you'll go back to space.
That is our cycle. Why do you threaten us?
Threaten? They didn't attack until I killed that first bug in my room. We started this damn war.
It is still a war. Either we die fighting them or we die from the hate.
We didn't know! We didn't mean to harm you. How much time do you need to complete your cycle?
Time?
Time, yes. You don't have time. Is your cycle near the beginning or is it near the end?
I have birthed half my young.
Half. That's good. Good. Half is... But does it need to be this hot?
Warmth propels the emergence. Your habitat is capable of even greater warmth, but it resists. Tell me why it does this.
Because it's a living being. A host. And this heat is very bad for our habitat.
We must strike before she decides to strike.
You are enemy.
If you keep it this warm, our habitat will die. And there will be no heat. And all of your young will die.
We don't hear all the details of the brokered resolution, but are given to understand that the Drac will be permitted to complete their reproductive cycle with the ship held at a temperature sufficient for them, but non-lethal for Aaron. The episode ends with 2 exchanges that show how John's successful brokering of this deal has earned him greater trust and acceptance from his crewmates. Aaron says she used to think that lesser forms of life should be crushed, but now realizes she was wrong, and we see him realize that she's talking about him. Zahn praises him more directly, saying he did well, and then we come to the lesson, the one of my epigraphs you'll hear, though not from me, just over a minute from the end of the episode.
Much.
Time and patience.
Time and patience. Is that your answer for everything?
Yes, because it's always the right answer.
Okay. How does time and patience answer this? We see the Dracs, or we saw them, as pests, something to be stepped on and crushed.
We were ignorant.
Well, I definitely pulverized one on sight. And I would have done the same thing to the dentic and those germ bugs that you injected me with when I first came on board.
The translator microbes.
Yeah, those guys. But see, you see them as good,
Oh, we've learned to work with them. Isn't it the same where you come from?
I guess. I mean, some people keep pets and others would just as soon eat.
If you're asking for a distinction, I think it's often unclear. Moira is alive and she's our protector, but she's also our servant. She relies on us and we rely on her. It's a mutual, symbiotic relationship.
So, who lives and dies in your world is as arbitrary as it is in mine.
The answer is reverence for all living beings, which may come with
time and patience.
Yes, John.
This scene strikes me as the opposite of a MacGuffin. In the place where almost every other television show and even many feature films would punt, which usually looks like a subtle fade out just as the character posed with the impossible question or about to read the work of heartbreaking genius begins to speak, but before they deliver the goods, there's no shirking here. So existentialists, be appraised. The answer to the arbitrariness of our deaths is reverence for all living beings, which may come with time and patience. What do we owe for this meal? In Meals to Come, The History of the Future of Food, Warren Belasco describes the centuries-long three-way debate between technocornucopians, Malthusians, and radical democratic optimists like William Godwin about how to feed the future as staking out essentially three positions. Number one, bake a bigger pie. Number two, put fewer forks on the table. Or number three, teach everyone better manners. Like Belasco, I favor the third option. But if we're always eating or being eaten, I think our manners might have to reach beyond the table. Here are 4 manners lessons from the etiquette guide I'm writing with the working title, How to Feed an Anti-Fascist Future. Number 1, curiosity. We should approach our constituent selves and symbiotic partners in the spirit of questioning and openness. Number 2, cosmopolitics. We must ensure that decisions take place somehow in the presence of those who must bear their consequences. I think about this as the nothing about us without us rule. Number 3, justice pattern. We ought to prioritize protection for the poor among humans, the most vulnerable among species and populations, and more diverse over less diverse systems. And number 4, non-hierarchical living. We must exercise vigilance against the self and will to power. Even for those of us who are new to thinking of ourselves as multiple and enmeshed, we have rich repositories to turn to. Philosophers hard at work on what our multiplicity means for ideas like free will and choice and rights. Poets and scholars who've modeled and practiced resistance to the liberal subject for generations. And stories that can guide us about what works and what doesn't. If this meal has left you craving a nonfiction example, I like the dish with one spoon treaty that Astra Taylor talks about in Democracy May Not Exist, but we'll miss it when it's gone. But I hope and expect that you may already be thinking about others or will in the coming days and weeks. And I invite you to send them to me. If you have any good stories, fiction or non, cautionary tales or behavioral primers or speculative futures, I think all kinds of stories can have useful lessons. But I'm only interested in stories that ring with truth, and The Tree Who Set Healthy Boundaries does not. Its ending looks to me like 2 billiard balls awkwardly yoked together. How to Feed an Anti-Fascist Future will be my attempt to figure out what it looks like to be multiple, and how to feed ourselves and others all throughout our dying lives with proper reverence for all our devouring selves. Thank you so much.